Okay, I think we can start now. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this debate, which is titled Escalation in Eastern Ukraine and Zelensky Domestic Challenges. My name is MARYLIA. I'm research assistant at the International Institute for Peace, and I'm going to moderate this discussion today. We will have three speakers, but before I introduce them, I would like to give an introductory word to the president of the International Institute for Peace and the former member of the European Parliament, Hannes Swoboda.
Thank you, Marylia, and welcome to all of you, and good afternoon or good morning to Anna. I hope it's a good morning in the US. Some weeks ago it would have been a very hot topic. Today it's perhaps not as hot as other topics, especially in the Middle East. But as we saw also in the Middle East, even conflicts which seem to be more or less boiling under the surface can explode. And when there were many Russian troops very close to the Ukraine border, many people feared that there could be an explosion intentionally or unintentionally in this critical region. Now, Marylia already mentioned that with President Zelensky, there is some change, at least from the outside. Maybe Mykola sees it different, but at the beginning, Zelensky was at least seen in the West as somebody who is trying to find an agreement, or let's see, some sort of a modus vivendi with the Russian President Putin in order to, to balance the situation and to keep it calm. More and more in due course of the last months, Zelensky or the government changed the course. It became more negative or critical about Putin and Russia. Also in the inside, if we see to Medvedchuk and the measures and the action taken against him, now I think he is accused of high treason. High treason is always a tricky issue. It's very often misused for political purpose, but I don't want to anticipate the discussion and the opinion of the people. At least there are close links and ties between Mr. Medvedchuk and President Putin or the Russian side. So in some way, it is in a very, let's say, is a symbol of the change of Zelensky's position. So there are two other issues which I just want to mention without, again, saying that you deal with it, but you will decide on your own. The one is the military buildup over? Are there still too many troops near the Ukrainian borders, and there is still some justification for anxieties, for fears that conflict can arise very soon again? And the other issue, of course, is the very difficult issue on Crimea. For some people, it was thought that perhaps the water issue, the delivery of water from Ukraine to the Crimea, which is, of course, legally a part of Ukraine, could solve some of the issues, could bring some peace. For others, it was clear you cannot bring water to an occupied area. It's a responsibility also according to international law for Russia to care for the people living on the island of Crimea. So there are many, many issues. And I think we have very good experts here who are very knowledgeable and have the experience in Ukraine with the OSCE and others. So I wish you a very interesting discussion. I will listen to it, of course, but it's now to you. And again, Marylia, thank you for organizing this event. And it's up to you now to take over and lead through the discussion.
Thank you, Hannes. Let me now introduce our speakers. I will start with Nikolai KAPITONENKO, who is expert in foreign policy at International Center for Policy Studies, ICPS, and he is also associate professor at the Institute of International Relations of Kyiv National Taras Shevchenko University, where he is currently engaged in a very active time period, examining students and checking their master thesis. So thank you, Nikolai, for being here despite this busy time for you. Our next speaker is Fred Tanner. Ambassador Tanner is a research associate at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, and he formerly served as senior advisor at to the OSCE Secretary General here in Vienna. He is also IIP Advisory Board member. Thank you very much, Fred, for coming also to this discussion. And finally, our third guest today is Anna ROMANDASH. Anna ROMANDASH is an award-winning journalist from Ukraine. She has collaborated with CNN, Radio Free Europe, Open Government Partnership, Freedom House, and Deutsche Welle. Anna, thank you for joining us, and good morning to you in the United States. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to start with the discussion. I will give the word first to Nikolai, who will probably talk a little bit more about domestic situation or domestic challenges that the Ukraine is facing this day.
Thank you, Marylia. Nice to see all of you and to talk about Ukraine, a hot topic for European security. And from time to time, it is a pleasure for me to share my ideas and assessment of what is happening in Ukraine and around. This time I will start with saying that the last time we met in the same nice format about several months ago, it has been already clear that the conflict in eastern Ukraine is moving along its most likely trajectory of a boiling conflict or a low-intensity military conflict, and that the ceasefire which Ukraine and Russia succeeded to agree in July last year was a long but anyway a temporary event and was doomed in a way because there was no perspective for further political resolution. And that can be said about the whole strategy President Zelensky applied to dealing with this issue, a very complicated issue which he promised to resolve before the elections, but which he obviously found too difficult to deliver. And currently, his strategy not only started, but clearly resembles the one of the previous president. And I think that that trend can be extended even further by saying that any Ukrainian politician would sooner or later feel most comfortable to fit into this strategy, which implies a very uncompromised stance against Russia, very hard red lines which he or she will not find possible to cross, absolutely no place for further compromises, which means that politically it will be impossible to reach any progress in dealing with the Donbass, because the core issues within the conflict, which imply the level of autonomy, elections, a return of the control of the border, withdrawal of forces, and issues of like amnesty, for instance, they are politically very complicated. And as it turns out, any Ukrainian president finds it much more comfortable to stick to the previous strategy and to deal with Russia as within a zero-sum game. So I don't see any zone of possible agreement in this conflict before any significant changes within political systems of either Ukraine or Russia. On the other hand, we had an escalation in spring, a crisis-like situation when Russia concentrated a huge number of troops along Ukrainian borders. And I was one of the few in Ukraine, observers in Ukraine, who actually didn't believe that this is going to result in any serious escalation or an open aggression, another wave of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Because in my view, what the stance which is currently in place in the eastern Ukraine is basically corresponding to Russia's fundamental interests. And Russia's position is the one of strategic defense. So they are okay with the existing status quo. And any escalation would bring about a very high cost and there is no way any political result can be achieved by applying military force. I think this is the lesson which have been learned by the Kremlin back in 2015. And what has been done towards Ukraine since then was quite moderate, I would say. It's understandable that people in Ukraine mostly do not have any positive emotions about Russian leadership. But actually, the Ukrainian strategy of President Putin after 2015 has been quite, I would say, moderate. He was trying to minimize risks, and I think that this is what he is going to do in the future. He was trying to lower the price of a Ukrainian conflict and to keep it under control. So because of that, I think that the pressure Russia implied was rather a response to rhetoric about the death of the Minsk process, which has been raised by Ukrainian politicians. And this actually reflects the vision which has been widespread in Ukraine for quite a long time, that there is no way to fulfill the Minsk agreements. There is no way to resolve the conflict in Donbass by doing that. That there is a dead end, and that Minsk format should be replaced by something else. If that is the case, then investing into efforts of replacing this format with something else would be the task both for Ukraine and Russia, and the only leverage Russia is currently having is its military force. That's why I think that this build-up has been an attempt to somehow pressure Ukrainian leadership and some of our Western partners in order to make something which comes after Minsk be more along the lines of the Russia's security interests. Another important development, in my view, is about Crimea. It's rather technical or diplomatic than significantly political, because Ukraine has launched a Crimean platform, which is to gather for the first summit in this summer. And this is gonna become a long-term instrument for diplomatic coordination about all issues which are connected to the Crimea, including the issues on water supplies and a number of other things, to which, as far as I know, there will be attempts to also to invite Russia to participate, but most likely they will be rejected. Along with the foreign policy issues, there have been some major developments inside Ukraine, of course. And they are mostly about steps which has been taken by President Zelensky since January this year, which have been seen as quite resolute and quite unexpected, especially taking into account that President Zelensky last year has significantly lost control over the parliament, although he has the largest fraction and nominally they hold the majority. But as several key votings indicated, he cannot control that majority anymore. So he was looking for an alternative instrument, and it looks like he has found the National Security Council as the one which has been already used to tackle the most important or challenging issues. There have been several meetings of the council which ended up with introduction of sanctions against Ukrainians, a topic which is heavily debated here in Ukraine, and lots of criticism about these steps and efforts because sanctions cannot be applied to Ukrainian citizens. They should be prosecuted in accordance with the Ukrainian law. So this ad hoc instrument has really caused a kind of sensation in Ukraine. But nevertheless, the sanctions have been applied. Zelensky, along with closing several TV channels controlled by the opposition, in particular by Mr. Medvedchuk, he also tried to replace the head of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine quite successfully. So in a way, this is an attempt for him to find different approaches to exercising his powers and to look for the ways for being re-elected for the second term. This trend continues, and the National Security Council has also taken several decisions against Ukrainian oligarchs, which are still, we have to wait and see for the consequences. But what we already know is that Mr. Medvedchuk has been accused of state high treason, and there has been also already a court decision, so he is placed under home arrest, and will be waiting for the next one. So far, this is a hot topic in Ukraine because Medvedchuk is seen as his image is quite demonized here in Ukraine, and he's seen as the person who is transmitting Russia's narratives and interests and generally protecting Russia's interests here in Ukraine. But along with that, he has been a negotiator in a number of issues about the conflict in Donbass, in particular about exchange of detained persons. However, after his party got some success in previous parliamentary elections, I guess he was mostly concentrated on Ukrainian issues and trying to build his Ukrainian agenda, internal agenda. Besides, the negotiation process has been deadlocked in a way, and mostly has been controlled not by Medvedchuk, but by the president's office from the Ukrainian side. So some would say that a war against oligarchs, actually any big businessman can be appointed as an oligarch, so there is so far no strict criteria for defining who they are, can be seen as the part of internal political struggle of Zelensky against his opponents. But there are many people who are ready to take it as a kind of patriotic, reform-minded internal political steps, which also may be helpful in dealing with the Russian threat as well. So this is an unfinished process, which has already raised a lot of emotions and a lot of criticism and a lot of expectations on the other hand, but still it's unclear how it will end. Along with that, speculations take place also about a possible meeting between Zelensky and Putin. The topic which has once been raised 2 years ago as soon as Zelensky has been elected president, a meeting which is splitting Ukrainian public opinion. Some Ukrainians think that this is unnecessary and impossible. Some think that direct negotiations are always better. But now I think that the problem is not in emotional assessment, but rather in practical significance, since the Kremlin has indicated for several times that a personal meeting and negotiations may have sense only if there is a progress in resolving the conflict, which is absent. So I think that the chances for such a meeting are quite low, but anyway, there are speculations about it. There has been also a visit of the American State Secretary to Kyiv, a much awaited visit, which in my view didn't bring any news, significant news, but in Ukraine, politicians are actively speculating about the upcoming NATO summit and readdressing the issue of getting the membership action plan for Ukraine, which is, in my view, also quite, there are low chances that that will happen. And generally, I think that we tend to overestimate the resolve of the Biden administration to radically change anything in its policy towards Ukraine. But this is how Ukrainian political landscape is being shaped so far. So on the one hand, fighting with oligarchs and trying to regain political support within the society, which helps a little bit since Zelensky's ratings have jumped up for several percent. On the other hand, dealing with the strategic implications of a deadlock of the conflict in the East, which continues to take away a significant part of Ukraine's resources, and simultaneously trying to build a more robust pro-Ukrainian coalition, both on regional and on the global level. This is what Ukrainian politics is about in recent 5-6 months, and this is where I will stop and will be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Nikolai, for this broad overview. Anna, would you like to continue?
Yeah, sure. I think it's very interesting to look how the conflict, the recent escalation was portrayed in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, also in Russia. I think in Ukraine, the talk about the escalation with Russia started happening in mid-March, maybe late March. So around that period, and then in April, it was the talk of the town. So everybody was talking about the new forces on the border, what that might mean, and what might happen. It's interesting because in Russia, the talk about the potential escalation, it was framed very differently. But this has started in late February, so it started way earlier than what was happening in Ukraine or in the West. And in Russia, the state media started framing the discussion, obviously, in the way they saw it would fit their narrative. So in late February already, we could see that a lot of Russian media were publishing information that it was actually Ukraine preparing for a full escalation, that Ukrainian forces were about to enter the occupied territories, that there were a lot of movement of the Ukrainian army, obviously a lot of news about, Nazis in Ukraine and things like that, which are very common for the Russian propaganda. What's also interesting, there were news about civilians being killed by the Ukrainian army without any proof. So that was already the narrative in Russia in the late February, kind of preparing the audience and the public for what was coming next in March and April. So mid-March, I think it was when the Ukrainian government started noticing and speaking up about the unusual greater activity on the border, in the gray area on the border between Ukraine, Donbass, and the territories that are occupied. And it was interesting to see how the response in Ukraine, it was very interesting to observe how the West responded to the calls of action from Ukrainian side, because the West obviously issued a lot of, deeply concerned letters, a lot of, threats of further sanctions and whatnot. And there was a lot of worry in the West and also in Ukraine, but it also showed that with or without escalation, the response would probably remain the same as it was throughout all of the previous years of the conflict. So it was very interesting for me that while there was an escalation and there was a lot of talk, in terms of actions, there weren't as many as, for example, the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainian president would have expected. And just as it started, it ended kind of in the same way. It started out of nowhere and it ended out of nowhere with Russian Minister of Defense announcing that now they're just moving away the troops from the border because they have finished their studies, because initially that was their reasoning, their explanation for why all of this troops have been moved. And I think it was interesting because it was probably not even meant for it was meant to scare, maybe to threaten, but it was also meant for very much domestic audience, to distract maybe Russians inside Russia, preparing for the farther Crimean platform that's about to happen in a few months. So it was a very distracting move that definitely led to a lot of scare, but it was not meant for action. And also it was unlikely that escalation on the border would lead to any real action. I believe a week ago, President Zelensky announced that the escalation on the border has ended, while the Minister of the Exterior of Ukraine claimed that while it has ended, the escalation has ended, Russia may still attack us anytime. And I think that's very important, the messages that the Ukrainian government wants to convey, that we're still vulnerable, that we need help from the EU, we need help from the United States, from all of the Western partners. Don't forget about us, keep sending help. But the Ukrainian government doesn't really have a clear strategy besides that. So this escalation showed that with or without the troops moving, there's very little strategy, there's very little, adequate response that's going to be followed from Ukraine or from the West.
Thank you, Anna. Fred, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Marylylia, and of course also to IIP for this invitation. Perhaps I think if you look at the conflict from perhaps more like an OSCE perspective, even though I don't represent the OSCE, it's really more a personal perception here and analysis. I think we should distinguish also the level of conflicts we see. I mean, on the one hand, of course, there's a conflict within Ukraine between the armed forces of Ukraine against Russian-supported separatists. Of course, then is a Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and then there is a Russian-Western conflict with a centerpiece being Ukraine. And I think they all are interrelated, there's all interactions, and that makes, of course, this entire theme so much more complex today. I can say a few words about the role of the OSCE, hopefully not too boring. Of course, the story begins in 2014 when we all know what happened at the time. The OSCE was empowered to build up a crisis management structure under the Swiss chairmanship at the time, which included the Trilateral Contact Group, which is still very active today. It's a political negotiation forum with Ukraine, Russia, and the OSCE, and of course also then the creation of the Special Monitoring Mission, the SMM. The OSCE did deploy SMM at the time as a civilian and unarmed monitoring force into Ukraine with the mandate to contribute to de-escalation of tensions, dialogue promotion, and now concentrates its activity in Donbass region primarily to observe the ceasefire agreement with a lot of help of advanced technology. I need, of course, also to mention the role of the Normandy format, which is made up by Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France, as this is the kind of highest political body when it comes to peace implementation in Ukraine. In this context, of course, Nicola already referred to the Minsk Agreement. That's really the kind of pièce de résistance right now in the political debate and the work also of the OSCE through the Trilateral Contact Group and of course also the Normandy format. The Minsk Agreement was signed in late 2014, 2015. Even so it has not been implemented, at least it helped to end the worst of the fighting at the time. Let's not forget, it was very bloody fighting. We had witnessed up to 13,000 people killed, 2 million people displaced, and the Minsk Agreement brought some order into it, at least a reference to which could be used to work to bring in all the parties, including also representatives of the so-called republics in Donbass. Now, the difficulty, Nicola referred also already to the difficulty of the implementation of the Minsk Agreement, because it would demand an exorbitant political price in terms of domestic politics to implement that agreement. Why? Well, I think also Nicola may refer to it somewhat. It's really about giving self-governance, special status to this Donetsk and Luhansk regions. It should be legislated by the Ukrainian parliament. It should be enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution. And it basically, it would give a strong concession by Ukraine to empower these breakaway republics politically and give Russia some kind of droit de regard on Ukrainian participatory politics. And also, I think also that Nicola referred to, technically speaking, it has to do also with the question of sequencing. What comes first? Should it be security first, no more shooting, withdrawal of troops, or should there be a political implementation first? When should free elections be held? before or after the special status attribution to the regions? When should Ukraine gain access to the borders with Russia? These are all questions which are still debated today. Actually, there is the so-called Steinmeier formula that proposed a clear roadmap, but it runs against the primacy of geopolitics and the lack of political will. Again, MYKOLA made the point, there's a trend that Ukrainian leaders kick the can down the road and do not assume responsibility to bring it up. There's one issue which really I feel needs to be debated, which Nicola brought up, is Minsk. Can Minsk really be replaced by something else? Can it be thrown out into the dustbin of history? Again, from a OSCE perspective and all the participating states, it's very clear that Minsk is non-negotiable. It's actually a mantra by all the capitals that there's no substitute possible at that stage in time. So I think I'd like now to just move on a little bit because I mean, Anna and Nicola mentioned everything relating to basically domestic politics. I'd just like to refer briefly to the ceasefire agreement in July 2020, which has been holding for a very long time. There was hope after there has been President Zelensky coming in with his slogan, "I bring peace to the Donbass." There was hope. Also, it reflected by the Normandy meeting in Paris in late 2019, where actually agreements were made to continue disengagement zones in addition to the additional three zones, and also an endorsement of the Steinmeier formula. So we now know, of course, this has not worked out. We have seen now that a lot of things went wrong over the last few weeks and months. We see again massive violations of the ceasefire reported by SMM on a daily basis. We see military and civilians killed again in the Donbass, and of course the massive buildup of Russian troops in at the eastern border of Ukraine and the Crimea. So let me just come to the last part of my brief introduction here. Again, I think Nicola referred to, of course, the deterioration of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. I mean, President Zelensky has really been pivoting towards the West, now officially a NATO hopeful with an European Union aspiration to build up Western solidarity with Ukraine. I think Ukraine today presents itself as the front line of the West against Russia. And of course, that doesn't pass very well with regard to Russia. There is also the Western support. I think, again, the visit of Secretary Blinken about 10 days ago was clearly also US support, not just NATO, but US support. But of course, these are all statements, basically help for self-help, but not really any kind of alliance which would be out of the question at that stage. But it will be interesting to see, as Nico referred to, what's going to happen in Brussels next month at the NATO summit. We know that partner states, including Ukraine, will not be admitted, but I'm sure that the Ukrainian request of a map will be certainly discussed. So the broader question really is that Ukraine also is a centerpiece of Russia-West problems. Again, I think Anna referred to that too. It's just also a relationship between European states, the US and Russia, based on containment, based on deterrence, sanctions, the issue about the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. These are all playing into the game now and the debate about Ukraine in this kind of relationship. Hannah SWOBODA asked, is the military buildup over? I would argue, in view of these developments, difficult developments, the buildup is officially over, but Russia always had a lot of forces around Ukraine, not just over the last few months. I think they are not for immediate invasion, but they're there for intimidation. Again, this time around, unlike 2014, the Russian mobilization has been very visible. And that had clearly, in my view, the purpose to put Ukraine on notice, not to be provocative, and clearly also the statements by Russian officials to be prepared to protect the Russians in Donbass, which of course also has been supported by the handout of passports, a lot of Russian passports in the Donbass area. The one area where I feel there's a lot of potential and danger of escalation is the geopolitical claim on the Sea of Azov by Russia. Moscow has announced that it is unilaterally closing the Kerch Strait between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov to naval vessels of Ukraine and other countries until the end of October. And here, of course, that's a clearly geopolitical claim which may lead to additional escalation. So what can be done? I think from an OSCE perspective, or a kind of mindset, if I could say, I think we need first to learn more where the red lines are. Red lines for Russia, Ukraine, the West. We need to look for space where cooperation and risk reduction measures are possible. I think we talk about incremental approach here. Could be reinforcement of the structured dialogue in the OSCE, full compliance with the Vienna documents on CSPMs. I'd like also refer here to the Cooperative Security Initiative report that was recently published by the Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung in Vienna and the GlobeSec in Bratislava with the support of the OSCE, making recommendations on short-term damage control and long-term working towards a high-level event, some kind of summit, which actually would not just be the summit between, let's say, President Putin and President Biden, but would be a much broader summit in the more long-term future, where there could be a new foundational document established for European security, also referring to arms control and risk reduction measures, and the principal re-engagement of cooperation. Okay, I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fred. Thank you to all. Maybe if you want to react to each other's statements, go ahead. But I would actually like to also raise one question, which all of you more or less touched upon, and that's perceptions of who actually started this escalation in the Donbass and what it was for. And as I understood, if I understood it correctly, Nikolai said that from Russian side, it more or less meant it was meant to strengthen sort of Russia's position for any future possible renegotiations. Anna referred to Russian media or Russian, information space, starting kind of preparing the public for it already in advance. Fred also said that it was meant more as an intimidation. But if you look, for example, at Russia's analysis or how they describe the situation, they actually say that Zelensky moved Ukrainian troops closer to Donbass region, and that alerted Russians, and then Russians sort of reacted and sort of overreacted intentionally to show that he shouldn't actually escalate the situation. Would you say that this analysis is reasonable? Would you say it's not correct? Or how would you assess this sort of position? Nikolai?
If I may, I do understand the Russian assessment of what was happening, but in my view, Russians have never treated Ukraine as a serious opponent. They were fighting against the West, broadly speaking, for a geopolitical recognition and for the bigger status globally. Because of that, I don't think that they would take any large-scale steps in response to any movements by Ukrainian army, especially taking into account that they effectively control the escalation in the east. So it's very unlikely that Ukraine will start any kind of offensive, and they know it. Usually, Russian military exercises are responses either to NATO military exercises in the region, or as we have already mentioned, the kind of applying a pressure on the other side. So I think that this kind of logic does not stand.
Thank you. Although I would say that it doesn't contradict the Russian logic, it just the stress on a different part of it, no? But okay, of course. Anna, if you would like to add.
Sure. I think from the very beginning, it was not about Ukraine, let's say, escalating what's already been escalated by Russia. I think Russia definitely underestimates Ukraine or does not treat it as somebody who can or who should influence its domestic or international policies and politics. So the escalation in Russia was not dictated by the situation in Ukraine specifically or by the media response in Ukraine specifically. There was a plan to do this, and then Ukrainian media and Ukrainian government responded in a certain way. But the Russian response to that reaction in Ukrainian media and the government, it was not influenced by that. So let's say Ukraine was a very passive observer of what was happening next to its border, and it didn't have a lot of leverage or a lot of influence to change what was happening there. It was in many ways a show for domestic audiences and for the Western audiences. But yeah, Ukraine just happened to observe, but didn't have a lot of control over what was happening.
Okay, Fred, if you would like to add anything on that.
Yes, I think it's very hard to say on a more, let's say, if you look at the Donbass area, who started doing what. I mean, looking at the SMM reports, which are daily, it was very clear with the concentration of Russian forces in the eastern part, on the eastern border, and also southern border, of course, of Ukraine. There has been violations of the ceasefire agreement by the fact that heavy weapons were moved back in to certain areas where they were not supposed to be. And actually yesterday, SMM reported again that it observed, I think, about 17 Russian tanks in certain areas, which, again, they're not supposed to be there. Some of them are there for exercises, but there has been a very unfortunate kind of dynamic of tit for tat and testing each other. I think the forces were testing each other with shooting, let's say, even with heavy weapons against each other, and then checking reactions. The SMM has been a victim of that because the drones, some of the SMM drones were jammed, and that on a very systematic fashion, because I think there has been very heavy electronic warfare going on in that period on both sides. And the SMM lost a long-range drone, which crashed down, and also short-range drones were disturbed as well, were jammed. So I think it was very clear there was an escalation. It was testing each other. How could troops quickly progress over longer distances logistically, and to see how is the other side reacting to this. So I think that really is what the SMM has been reading through its, and what I have been reading through the reports I have been seeing, where everybody can read these reports, which are published daily on the website. And we really don't know if there has been a complete de-escalation now. I mean, there are a lot of forces still in the back, in the exercise fields. First we thought more like these troops came in also for the parades of, I think, the 9th of May, victory parades in Donetsk and Luhansk. Suddenly had many more forces which really were allowed according to the ceasefire agreement, but they really did not really disappear too much. So we still are in a situation which is quite critical.
Thank you. Let me go into the Q&A session. If you would like to address any questions, just go ahead. I would like to start with the following one. If Putin fails to get what he wants from US during the summit with Biden, should we expect a new wave of escalation on the border as only troops will move back, but not military equipment? And that also partially refers to what maybe Fred was saying, that actually, for now, maybe the military buildup stopped, but not entirely. If anyone wants to address this one.
Well, I think that there is no way for Putin to use Ukraine as a hostage in shaping his relations with the United States. Because for the United States, Ukraine has already taken a quite firm and modest place in its grand strategy. So I don't think that Ukraine is important enough for the United States to react in a way to any concentration of force of Russian military forces around its borders. And that would be also a costly effort for Putin. So I don't think that he can use this kind of build-ups and provocations to improve his negotiation positions in a dialogue with Washington.
Thank you. Hannes SWOBODA also was asking, I think you saw it also in the chat, what you think about this recent Zelensky-Erdogan meeting, and generally Erdogan's strong support to Ukraine during the escalation.
Well, yes, really, Turkey has become one of Zelensky's most favorite directions, and his probably best most close foreign policy partner. And I think that mostly because of the importance of the Black Sea, generally Black Sea region, and the issue of Crimea for foreign policy agendas of both countries. So this has become a bridge or a link between the foreign policy of Ukraine and foreign policy of Turkey. Turkey has been active in everything which concerns Crimea, including providing of assistance for building houses, for instance, for Crimean Tatars who returned to Ukraine after occupation. There is a somewhat potential in military cooperation between Ukraine and Turkey. There are interests in Turkish investment in Ukraine. There are ongoing negotiations over free trade area between the two countries. So there is a rich agenda for bilateral relations, and that has been exploited by the leadership of the two countries. I don't think that this kind of closeness may be called a truly alliance, because there will be no need, no security guarantees on either side. But this is rather a temporary tactical cooperation, which fits current interests of both countries. But I'm not sure that it will be a strategic one, since Turkey is playing away different set of games at different levels than the one Ukraine plays. And also Turkey has its own very special kind of relations with Russia, which is not at all antagonistic, but quite pragmatic. So I think there are strict limits to this cooperation, and probably they have already been reached.
Anna?
Just to add to that, I think Turkey is involved in a lot of regional conflicts, and in some of these conflicts, the interests of Russia and Turkey are very different. And I think this is what's playing into the partnership between Ukraine and Turkey. But it is difficult to say how long it would last or how deep it can get, because again, Turkey is very, very involved in Middle East. It was involved with Armenia, Azerbaijan war that was quite recent. And Russia was also involved in all of these regions, in all of these situations. And again, it's difficult to determine how much of a role is Ukraine playing or willing to play, and how much it is interested in, deepening or influencing this partnership with Turkey.
Yeah. Maybe another question regarding the conflict area and the contact line in the east of the country. Maybe Fred, since you also spoke about the OSCE mission, maybe if you can tackle that. Stephanie Fankert is asking, considering the long duration of the conflict already, what does this mean for the people living in these areas? Is there still a lot of movement on the contact line? How is the situation? How is the situation for the millions of people in their everyday life? Also, any of you, of course, can jump in on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think here we need, of course, to look also at the COVID pandemic and the mobility between the occupied territory and Ukraine was severely hampered. I mean, there have been 2 or 3 checkpoints, and of course the bridge in the Luhanska, which has been rebuilt, but the mobility basically has really been curtailed. We know that quite a few pensioners still try to go to the Ukrainian side to collect their pensions or from some family issues, but that really has slowed down a lot. Again, I refer to this Paris meeting of the Normandy in 2019, and actually there's going to be in a couple of days another meeting of the trilateral contact group in Minsk, and they would like to bring up again these commitments from that meeting in Paris, which means opening more checkpoints, opening more entry and exit points between the occupied territory and the Ukrainian-controlled armed forces controlled area. This is really something, I mean, for the SMM, it has been very difficult because let's say the Donetsk or Luhansk, so-called republics, would just say, you cannot come in anymore. We are in a lockdown for the pandemic. And the contact line, in a way, became almost a front. It really became some kind of border. And that's, of course, something which we see, I think, together with Ukraine, definitely wants to avoid. So the pandemic played a very important role in these developments and had a big impact upon the mobility of the civilian population.
Let me ask you the next question, also a bit of a provocative one. The attendee of this debate, of this conversation, is asking or saying that occupied territories in Donbass would never come back to Ukraine under the current situation when they already received military and other support from Russian Federation. Would it be advisable to proceed the way of full separation of those 2 territories and focus on building more conducive economic and social conditions in the rest of Ukraine to make it more attractive? I think this is also a view expressed by, or at least kind of correlates with the Ukrainian, let's say, NATO ambition. With NATO would not actually accept Ukraine in the state it is right now, but can we speak about these things at all at the current point of time?
I think that, this option has been raised already in 2014, that we should just cut off the occupied territories and continue reforming the state and turning into an example of success. But that didn't work out. And I have several explanations for that. One of them is more or less academic, because there is a nationalist discourse prevailing in Ukraine. Nationalism is on the rise. And as an ideology, nationalism, it in a way makes territory sacred. So if you say that you are okay with part of the territory of the country going away, you won't be politically popular in a country under nationalist discourse. And there are very few politicians in Ukraine who are ready to say publicly that, okay, let's give away Donbass to Russia. And from a less academic perspective, I think that as any long-lasting conflict, the conflict in Donbass has been institutionalized and has become a part of an everyday social and political life. And there are forces both in Ukraine and in Russia, and especially, of course, in the so-called DNR/LNR, which used to use the conflict for their own interests. the so-called spoilers, who are against any changes in the status quo, including this one. Because of that, everybody is more okay with the things continuing to be like this as of any radical changes. And I don't think also that the scenario like this would significantly change the chances of Ukraine to become a member of NATO, since formally there is no any sort of prohibition for taking in states with territorial disputes. There has been an oral arrangement somewhere in the beginning of the 90s not to do that in order not to escalate risks for the alliance. But formally, there is nothing like that. In the Washington Treaty, nothing is mentioned about this. So I think that the problem is different, is that the Ukraine in its current stance is not an asset for NATO, a security asset, but rather a problem or a risk. So even if somehow the issue of Donbas is closed, and somehow the issue of the Crimea is closed, well, we will get back to, we will still have a Crimea on the agenda, even if we agree on cutting off Donbas. Still, Ukraine will have no chances to become a member of NATO because it will only put additional risks to the alliance's security. So the problem is in this, in Ukraine's inefficiency and being a problem rather than an asset, not in having open territorial disputes with Russia.
Thank you, Nicola. Anna, yeah, please.
Yeah, just really briefly, they regularly do the public opinion polls on what Ukrainians expect would be the ideal solution for Donbas. I think it's also interesting how the solutions change depending on the region. So the closer you get to the affected regions, the more likely people are to accept the partition. So the public opinion is still very much against this divide. Only if you go more to the west, then this idea, let's say, more tolerable, but it's still not widely accepted by the public. So majority of Ukrainians, at least, would not express, their agreement to partition the country or to give up on the territories which are currently occupied.
Thank you. Okay, I think it's actually a good time to wrap up our discussion. We covered a lot of Ukraine's domestic challenges and recent developments. And as Nikolai referred to it at the very beginning, they were already sort of anticipated some months ago. So maybe for those who closely followed the events, it wasn't such a big surprise what happened in the east of the country. And thank you all very much also for your inputs and also the discussion of the international actors of the United States, of the role of the OSCE and the SMM on the contact line. Maybe one actor which we didn't really refer to yet is the European Union. But I would like to ask Hannes SWOBODA also to give his concluding statement and maybe in some sort of way mention it and say how actually the EU can relate to this whole situation.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your statements and the debate. I think the real issue is how can we live with the crisis as it is? Nikolai and also Anna, the quite honest, said there is no big interest to change. The status quo is as it is. But we know from Nagorno-Karabakh there was a status quo, there were no big conflicts, and all of a sudden it exploded. Of course, it was a different situation. Also, as I mentioned before, the Middle East is the different situation. But maybe because Marylia, you mentioned the European Union, the only real thing what we can do now, at least, is to transform Ukraine, to help also from the European side to transform and modernize Ukraine without saying that the Donbas should go away. So this kind of growing attractiveness of Ukraine, the non-occupied areas, I think is very important. But here it comes to the clash with an extreme nationalism. And we mentioned Medvedchuk at the beginning, and also Nikolai. I cannot, evaluate the details, but if it is a sign of further internal dispute, a conflict, because the voters of Medvedchuk, it's not so much concern about him, but the voters feel again pushed aside and pushed away, then I think it is dangerous. So I think what the European Union should do is, of course, try to soften at least this kind of strong nationalism, that there is some nationalism in a country which is in a conflict with its neighbor is clear, is evident, and then try to have a serious and honest job in curtailing the power of the oligarchs. I don't think you can go away with it, and try step by step to modernize the country, and at the same time continue at least some minimum dialogue with Russia. This is the only way I think Europe can help Ukraine, not in offering membership, which is not possible, not in offering membership for NATO, which is not possible. So to be realistic, but think for the long term. Again, the danger is always here that the explosion will come, but at least we could minimize the risk of an explosion by let's say, a wide and comprehensive, slow, step-by-step transformation of the country. But the major job has to be done in Ukraine itself. Again, thank you very much, and thank you, MARYLIA, for organizing this debate. There's not too much hope, but at least we can hope that the pessimism will not prevail. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you very much. And thank you all for participating in the discussion. And until next time. Bye-bye.